What if I told you that the greatest story of destiny didn't begin in a palace, but in rejection? What if the most powerful miracle in history was born in poverty, tested by doubt, and almost crushed by misunderstanding? Tonight, we're not just revisiting a sacred story. We're uncovering the hidden tears, the silent sacrifice, and the unseen strength behind it. This isn't just about prophecy. It's about a young woman facing public rejection. It's about a man wrestling with doubt in the darkest night of his life. It's about eternal love being tested before it becomes legacy. You're going to see the parts most people skip. The emotional weight of obedience. The spiritual battle inside a marriage. The closed doors. The humiliation. The fear. And more importantly, you're going to see why this ancient story still speaks directly to modern families today. Because rejection still exists. Doubt still enters relationships. And destiny still whispers before it roars. If you stay with me until the end, you'll understand something powerful. Miracles don't remove struggle. They redefine it. And humble beginnings might be the birthplace of your greatest breakthrough. So take a deep breath. Lean in. And let's step into Nazareth, where faith, suffering, and redemption collide. And if stories like this move you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because here, we turn music into unforgettable journeys. Nazareth wasn't the kind of place people wrote songs about, not the kind of town that made the rich lean back in their chairs and say, "Now that's where greatness begins," because everything there looked small, dusty, and painfully ordinary. The streets were tight, the homes were simple, and the air carried that mix of baked clay, sweat, and bread that only poor villages seemed to know how to make feel like a daily prayer. People lived under pressure, always watching, always careful, because when you're part of an oppressed people, even your silence has to be measured like water in a cup. And still, every evening, you'd hear the same thing whispered between neighbors like it was a secret that kept them alive. One day, the liberator will come. One day, the prophecy will finally breathe. It's funny, though, when folks imagine a savior, they picture a throne, a trumpet, a spotlight. But Nazareth had none of that, just humble beginnings and tired hands. And right there, inside that nothing special village, lived a girl named Mary, and no one could have guessed that destiny sometimes hides in plain sight. Because the wild truth is this: history doesn't always start with a roar. Sometimes it starts with a whisper and a teenage girl trying to carry hope without breaking. Mary wasn't famous, not even close, and nobody in town would have pointed at her and said, "That one, she's going to shake the world," because she looked like everyone else. She carried water, she helped at home, she moved through the day like any young woman trying to stay steady inside a life that didn't give you many soft places to land. The elders talked about kings and empires like they were storms in the distance, but Mary felt storms in the present. Poverty at the door, fear in the streets, and that constant feeling that tomorrow could be worse. Still, she had this quiet way of holding herself, like someone who'd learned early that unseen strength isn't loud, it's stubborn, it's the kind that shows up even when you don't feel like it. And that's something people today can understand, right? When you wake up heavy, bills stacked, problems waiting, but you still wash your face and step forward like, "Okay, let's do this." That's Mary, not dramatic for attention, but steady in the way that makes you realize courage can look like plain clothing and tired eyes. And even though she didn't have gold, she had something rarer: faith that didn't need applause to be real. Now Joseph, he was known, not as a prince, not as some flashy hero, but as a man who worked, the kind of guy whose hands told his story before his mouth ever did. He was practical, grounded, the type who didn't waste words because life in Nazareth didn't reward dreamers who forgot to eat. And when he looked at Mary, it wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, like he saw a sacred promise forming in the simplest place. Two people choosing each other in a world that kept trying to break them. They weren't building a fantasy, they were building a life. Small meals, small laughter, small plans, but plans that felt big because they meant survival together. You know that kind of love. The one that isn't loud online, not posted for strangers, just real in the way someone remembers how you take your tea, or saves you the warmer side of the blanket. That was them, eternal love in seed form, not perfected yet, but growing quietly where nobody thought anything valuable could grow. And in a town full of suffering, that kind of love already felt like a miracle. But here's what people forget. When a place is under oppression, hope becomes dangerous, because hope makes you look up, and looking up makes you want change. So the village carried a strange tension, half prayer, half fear, like everyone was waiting for the sky to split open, but also terrified of what would happen if it did. The men talked tough, like, if the liberator comes, we'll rise. But at night you could hear the truth in their breathing. They were exhausted, and fear had been their roommate for years. And the women? Oh, the women carried the heaviest part, because they didn't just survive for themselves, they survived for the children, the sick, the elderly, and the men who were too proud to admit they were breaking. That's why Mary's world was full of hidden tears. Tears swallowed so the family could eat, tears wiped quickly so no one would call you weak. If you've ever had to smile while your chest felt tight, if you've ever had to be strong, because nobody else was going to do it, you already understand her world. And in that world, Mary learned early that silent sacrifice isn't a choice you celebrate. It's just what love demands when life is hard. Some nights Mary would stand outside, looking over the quiet roofs, hearing distant dogs, feeling the cold settle into the stones, and she'd wonder what the prophecy really meant. Would the liberator come with armies? Would he shatter chains? Would he punish the powerful? Or would he heal the broken in a way no sword ever could? She didn't have answers, but she had that strange pull in her heart, the feeling that divine purpose was real, even if she couldn't explain it, even if she couldn't prove it. And look, that's the part people don't like to admit. Faith isn't always comfortable, it's not always a happy song, sometimes it's choosing to trust while you're still shaking. She'd breathe in, whisper a prayer, then go back inside, because tomorrow still needed bread, still needed work, still needed her to be present. But deep down, something was quietly shifting, like destiny was turning its head toward her, like heaven was watching her footsteps in that tiny village. And she had no idea that one day soon, a divine message would arrive, and the life she knew would never be the same. Even in the ordinary moments, there were signs of a bigger story trying to break through, like when a poor neighbor shared food they barely had, or when Joseph fixed something for free because he couldn't stand watching someone suffer. Those little acts, small mercy, small kindness, were like sparks in the dark night, proof that hope still lived in people even when the world tried to choke it out. That's why Nazareth felt like a paradox, a place full of suffering, yet full of stubborn love, the kind that refuses to die. Mary and Joseph were part of that, two hearts trying to live clean in a world that rewarded harshness, and that alone made them stand out. And if you're listening right now, maybe you've been that person too, the one trying to do right while everyone else says, "Why bother?" Just know this, the biggest miracles often start in people who keep choosing good when nobody is clapping. And that's exactly why destiny was already moving, quietly, toward Mary. Because the truth is, the world loves to celebrate the ending, crowns, victories, legends, but it never talks enough about the beginning, the part where everything looks fragile. It never talks about the uncertainty, the risk, the obedience, the fear of being misunderstood, the feeling of walking forward without a map. And Mary, she was right at that edge, still just a girl to everyone else, still invisible to the powerful, still ordinary in a village nobody respected. But heaven doesn't measure people the way crowds do, and divine purpose doesn't look for perfect backgrounds, it looks for willing hearts. So while Nazareth slept, while Joseph planned simple dreams, while Mary carried water and quiet prayers, the story was already loading, like a storm behind the horizon. And the next moment, the one that changes everything, wasn't going to come with drums or fireworks, it was going to come like a whisper in the soul. Because soon, Mary would receive a divine message, and the first thing it would test wasn't her strength, it would test her faith. Before the divine message, before the miracle, before the spiritual battle that would test everything, there was something almost painfully ordinary between Mary and Joseph, love that grew quietly in the middle of poverty. It wasn't the kind of love written in royal scrolls or sung in grand halls, it was the kind built between shared responsibilities, tired evenings, and simple promises whispered when no one else was around. Joseph would walk her home slowly, stretching the path just to steal a few more minutes of conversation, talking about the future like two young souls trying to design stability in a fragile world. Mary would listen with that gentle smile, the kind that doesn't need many words, because sometimes faith is strongest when it's silent and shared between two hearts. They didn't dream of empires or thrones, they dreamed of a small house, steady work, children laughing in the courtyard, and peace that no oppressor could take from them. And if you think about it, that's what most people still want today. Nothing extravagant, just someone who stays, someone who means it when they say, "I'm not going anywhere." That was their sacred promise, not carved in stone, but carved in daily choices. Joseph wasn't a loud man, but he carried what I like to call quiet integrity, the kind of character that shows up when nobody is watching, when doing right costs you something. He worked with wood all day, shaping beams and doors, and sometimes he'd say that building a home was more than structure, it was protection, it was legacy, it was love made visible. Mary admired that about him, because in a land filled with uncertainty, a man who built stability with his hands felt like hope in human form. They would talk about destiny, not in grand prophetic terms, but in small, grounded ways. "We'll make it," he'd say, brushing dust from his sleeves. "We'll build something that lasts." And Mary believed him, not because life was easy, but because faith becomes easier when someone walks beside you instead of ahead of you. Their eternal love wasn't dramatic. It was steady, the kind that feels like a warm lamp in a dark night rather than a flash of lightning. And sometimes the most powerful miracles begin long before anyone realizes heaven is involved. In Nazareth, marriages weren't just romantic dreams. They were survival partnerships, sacred agreements that meant, "I choose you even when life gets hard." The oppressed people around them understood that loyalty wasn't optional. It was oxygen, because betrayal in a fragile society could shatter more than just two hearts. Mary and Joseph knew that too, which is why their bond wasn't careless or rushed. It was built on obedience to faith, respect, and that invisible thread of divine purpose they couldn't fully name yet. They would sit under the evening sky, watching the stars, sometimes wondering if the prophecy the elders spoke about would ever reach their generation. Joseph would joke lightly, trying to ease the heaviness in the air, but beneath the humor there was longing, the kind that makes a man stare at the horizon like he's waiting for history to shift. Mary would feel that same longing in her chest, like a quiet pull toward something bigger, though she couldn't explain it without sounding strange. And so they kept loving each other in the middle of waiting, which might be the hardest form of love there is. There's something people don't often talk about. Love before crisis feels simple, but it's actually being tested in ways you can't see yet. Every shared meal, every resolved disagreement, every act of patience is laying the foundation for storms that haven't arrived. Joseph didn't know that his faith would soon be stretched beyond logic, and Mary didn't know her courage would be weighed against public shame. Right then, they were just two young souls holding hands in a dusty village, unaware that destiny was already leaning closer. They laughed about small things, burnt bread, stubborn goats, neighbors who gossiped too much, and those ordinary joys felt like treasure in a land marked by poverty. It's important to see that part, because when doubt comes later, you need to remember what was real before fear tried to rewrite the story. And what they had was real, solid, built not on fantasy but on unwavering loyalty. Joseph would sometimes talk about providing more, about wanting Mary to feel secure despite the oppression surrounding them. He didn't have gold, but he had determination, and in a way, that's a richer inheritance than silver ever was. Mary would reassure him softly, telling him that love wasn't measured in coins but in presence, in showing up when it counts. And that kind of conversation, that gentle exchange of reassurance, is something couples today still crave, even in modern cities and busy lives. Because no matter the century, what sustains a relationship isn't luxury, it's unseen strength and the willingness to protect each other's hearts. They were building something invisible but powerful, something heaven seemed to notice long before they did. And sometimes, when love is that pure, it attracts both blessing and testing. The village saw them as stable, predictable, the kind of couple you nod approvingly at during gatherings. No one suspected that their story would one day be whispered across generations, not because of scandal, but because of divine intervention. Mary felt safe with Joseph, and safety is a rare gift in a world full of spiritual battles and political tension. She trusted him with her laughter, with her doubts, with the small fears she never showed publicly. And Joseph trusted her with his dreams, with the pressure he felt to be strong when the world kept pushing down. Together, they formed a quiet fortress against rejection and uncertainty, a partnership grounded in faith rather than fear. But love, no matter how solid, can tremble when the unexpected enters the room. And that's the part that changes everything, because just when a life feels steady, just when a sacred promise feels secure, heaven sometimes interrupts the ordinary. Mary would soon face a divine message that would shake not only her future, but Joseph's trust, the village's perception, and the fragile balance they had built. It wouldn't come with applause, it wouldn't come with explanation manuals, it would come like lightning inside the soul. And she would have to decide, between fear and faith, between reputation and obedience, between comfort and divine purpose. But in that moment, she was still just a young woman in love, unaware that her courage would redefine history. Joseph was still planning a simple wedding, unaware that his heart would soon enter the darkest night of doubt. Because sometimes destiny waits until love is strong, before it tests whether that love can survive heaven's calling. It didn't happen in a palace, it didn't happen in front of crowds, and there were no trumpets announcing what was about to unfold. It happened in silence, in the kind of ordinary day that doesn't warn you it's about to divide your life into before and after. Mary was alone, moving through familiar tasks, when the air itself seemed to grow heavier, not in fear, but in significance, like the world had paused to listen. And then came the divine message, not shouted, not forced, but delivered with a clarity that pierced deeper than sound ever could. She felt it before she fully understood it, that overwhelming awareness that destiny was no longer distant prophecy but something stepping directly into her story. Her first reaction wasn't celebration, it was trembling, because when divine purpose chooses you, it doesn't ask if you feel ready. Faith sounds beautiful in sermons, but in real life it often feels like standing on the edge of something impossible and being asked to step forward anyway. And Mary knew, in that instant, that her simple life in Nazareth would never again belong only to her. The message was clear. She would carry a child, not just any child, but the fulfillment of prophecy, the long-awaited hope of an oppressed people, the miracle whispered about for generations. The weight of it pressed against her chest, not like glory, but like responsibility, because being chosen doesn't erase fear, it magnifies it. She thought of Joseph immediately, of his steady hands and practical mind, of the sacred promise they had built together. How do you explain something heaven-born to a man who values order, reputation, and truth? How do you protect eternal love when the explanation sounds impossible, almost unbelievable? Her heart raced between joy and dread, because while the message carried hope for the world, it carried potential rejection for her. And sometimes obedience feels like walking straight into misunderstanding. She could have resisted, she could have asked for another path, another person, another timing, but something inside her chose courage. That unseen strength she'd carried since childhood rose quietly, steadying her breathing, grounding her thoughts. Faith isn't loud confidence, sometimes it's a whisper that says, "Trust anyway." And Mary, with hidden tears forming in her eyes, accepted the sacred promise without fully knowing the cost. She said yes not because it was easy, but because obedience mattered more to her than comfort. That yes was a silent sacrifice, a surrender of reputation, security, and control. And heaven recorded it long before the village ever would. But acceptance doesn't cancel anxiety, it only gives it direction. Mary walked back into her daily life carrying a secret that felt heavier than any water jar she had ever lifted. The streets of Nazareth looked the same, the dust still clung to her sandals, the neighbors still whispered about politics and survival, unaware that redemption had just entered human history. She looked at Joseph differently now, not because her love changed, but because the stakes had. Every shared smile felt fragile, every conversation felt like borrowed peace before a storm. She knew doubt would eventually knock, and she feared that knock more than public shame. Because losing reputation is one thing, losing the trust of the man you love is another. There's a lesson here most people miss. Destiny often isolates you before it elevates you. When you carry something others can't see, whether it's a calling, a dream, or a conviction, you often walk alone for a while. Mary couldn't explain the divine message without sounding delusional, and yet it burned inside her like undeniable truth. She probably rehearsed the conversation with Joseph in her mind 100 times, imagining his face, his silence, his hurt. If you've ever had to tell someone something that might change how they see you forever, you know that weight. It's the kind that keeps you awake at night, staring into darkness, praying for courage to speak. And that dark night was approaching faster than she wanted. Joseph, meanwhile, was planning, building, dreaming in practical terms, unaware that heaven had already altered the blueprint. He trusted Mary, trusted her faith, trusted her character, and that trust made what was coming even more painful. Because when love is real, doubt doesn't arrive gently, it crashes into your chest and demands answers. Mary knew that soon she would have to choose between silence and truth, between fear and faith, between protecting herself and honoring divine purpose. And every step she took felt like walking toward a spiritual battle that would test not only her courage, but Joseph's heart. The miracle was forming quietly within her, but outside, misunderstanding was forming too. And when the moment of confession arrived, heaven would wait, not just for Mary's faith, but for Joseph's decision. The world thinks miracles are easy stories, wrapped in light and applause, but the beginning of redemption is often messy, misunderstood, and painful. Mary carried hope for humanity, yet she also carried the risk of rejection from the one man whose opinion mattered most. Her destiny was clear, but the path toward it was anything but smooth. And in that fragile space between promise and explanation, love would be tested in ways neither of them expected. Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't the prophecy fulfilled, it's the heart that chooses to stay when doubt has every reason to leave. And Joseph was about to face that exact choice. The night of doubt was coming, and it would either break their sacred promise or make it unshakable. When Mary finally told Joseph, the world didn't explode. It went quiet, and sometimes silence hurts more than shouting ever could. He didn't interrupt her at first, didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He just listened, and the more she spoke about the divine message, the heavier the air became between them. You could almost feel the sacred promise they built trembling in that small space, like a wooden beam under sudden weight. Joseph's mind wasn't cruel, but it was rational, grounded, trained to understand cause and effect, not mysteries that defy logic. He loved her, deeply, truly, but love doesn't cancel doubt. Sometimes it magnifies it. And in that moment, eternal love collided with human confusion, and neither of them knew which would win. Because when trust feels threatened, even the strongest hearts shake. Joseph walked away that evening without slamming a door, without dramatic gestures, and somehow that restraint made it worse. He stepped into the dark night carrying questions that clawed at his chest. Was he being fooled? Was he being tested? Was he about to lose everything he thought was certain? In a village like Nazareth, reputation wasn't just pride, it was survival, and scandal could isolate a man faster than poverty ever could. He thought about the oppressed people around him, about how fragile stability already was, and how one misunderstanding could ripple outward. Part of him wanted to defend her, to believe blindly, to protect the woman he loved without hesitation. Another part of him feared being misunderstood himself, feared looking naive in a world that rewarded skepticism. And so he walked under the stars, torn between pride and compassion. Mary, meanwhile, remained still after he left, feeling the weight of unseen strength pressing harder than ever. She didn't chase him, didn't beg, didn't argue louder than her fear. She simply stood in faith, even as hidden tears traced quietly down her face. Obedience sometimes means standing firm while the one you love wrestles with doubt. She knew this wasn't just about pregnancy. It was about Joseph's identity, his integrity, his entire sense of order. If he chose to leave, she would bear more than rejection. She would carry shame, isolation, and whispers that never fully fade. But she also knew divine purpose doesn't shrink when humans hesitate. And so she waited, because faith often requires patience before it sees confirmation. Joseph didn't sleep that night. He replayed every memory, every shared laugh, every moment of trust, trying to measure whether doubt deserved more space than love. He remembered her honesty, her quiet courage, the way she held faith even when life felt unfair. Could a woman like that lie? Could she invent something so sacred? He felt anger rise and fall like waves, but beneath it all was heartbreak, the kind that makes a strong man sit alone and question himself. This wasn't just about a child, it was about destiny interrupting his carefully built future. And heaven, silent but watching, waited for his choice. Here's something people rarely admit. Real faith is often forged in confusion, not clarity. Joseph had every logical reason to walk away, to protect his name, to avoid public rejection. No one would have blamed him. In fact, most would have praised him for acting wisely. But wisdom and courage don't always look the same, and sometimes the bravest act is staying when leaving feels justified. He wasn't weak for struggling. Struggle is the evidence that love matters. And if you've ever faced a moment where walking away felt easier than trusting, you know exactly what he was feeling. That dark night wasn't just his test, it was their turning point. As dawn approached, something shifted, not dramatically, not with thunder, but with clarity. Joseph realized that his fear was louder than his love, and that fear had never built anything lasting. He understood that divine purpose doesn't always arrive wrapped in logic, and that faith sometimes demands humility before it offers explanation. The spiritual battle inside him quieted, replaced not with full understanding, but with decision. He chose to protect her, to stand beside her, to risk misunderstanding rather than abandon sacred promise. It wasn't blind faith, it was courageous obedience. And that decision changed not only his life, but the course of redemption itself. When he returned to Mary, he didn't bring perfect answers, but he brought presence. And sometimes presence is more powerful than certainty. He looked at her differently, not with suspicion, but with resolve, as if he had stepped into something bigger than both of them. Their love, once simple and predictable, had now survived its first true storm. It wasn't naive anymore, it was tested, refined, strengthened through doubt. And that kind of love doesn't break easily. But if they thought the hardest part was over, they were about to discover that rejection from the world can hurt just as much as doubt within the heart. The decree came suddenly, cold and impersonal, like most decisions made by powerful empires that never see the faces of the people they affect. A census. Registration. Names reduced to numbers under a system that didn't care about faith, prophecy, or fragile pregnancies. And so Mary and Joseph had to travel, not because they wanted to, but because oppressed people don't always get to choose comfort. She was already carrying the weight of destiny, her body growing heavier each day, her steps slower, her breath shorter. Joseph packed what little they had, his jaw set tight, because sometimes love looks like preparation in silence. The road ahead wasn't poetic, it was rough, uneven, and unforgiving. And rejection was waiting long before they reached the city. The journey itself became a quiet test of endurance. Dust clung to Mary's skin, the sun burned during the day, and the cold wrapped around them at night like a reminder that poverty doesn't pause for miracles. Joseph walked close, always alert, always watching for danger, because protecting her wasn't optional, it was his sacred promise. Mary didn't complain, though pain pulsed through her back and legs. Unseen strength carried her forward step by step. Every mile felt like obedience in motion, like faith being measured not in words but in perseverance. If you've ever kept going when your body begged you to stop, you understand her courage. Destiny doesn't always come wrapped in comfort, sometimes it comes on blistered feet. When they finally arrived, hope flickered briefly. Surely there would be space for a pregnant woman, surely someone would see their need. But doors don't always open just because your story is important. They knocked once, then twice, then again, explaining softly, asking humbly, but rejection has a way of sounding polite while still being firm. No room. We're full. Try somewhere else. Joseph's shoulders tightened with every refusal, not from anger alone, but from helplessness. Mary stood beside him, exhausted, carrying both miracle and humiliation in the same breath. And the irony was unbearable. The world was waiting for a liberator, and had no room for him. There's something deeply human about closed doors. Sometimes rejection isn't loud or cruel, it's indifferent, and indifference can wound even deeper. No one insulted them openly, they just didn't matter enough to rearrange comfort. And how often does that still happen today? We say we believe in hope, in change, in redemption, but when it asks for inconvenience, we hesitate. Mary felt that sting, not just as a woman about to give birth, but as a soul witnessing humanity's blind spots. Humble beginnings are rarely celebrated in real time. Joseph searched desperately, pride dissolving into urgency. He would have traded his reputation, his rest, anything for a safe place for her to lie down. Love doesn't look heroic in those moments. It looks frantic, sweaty, almost desperate. He found a stable, hardly shelter, barely protection, but it was something. The smell of animals filled the air, the floor was rough, and the space felt forgotten by comfort. Mary lowered herself carefully, her body trembling with exhaustion, yet her faith remained steady. Because even when the world rejects you, divine purpose doesn't retreat. The night grew darker, colder, heavier. There were no royal linens, no midwives of status, no applause waiting outside. Just two young souls, clinging to each other, trying to hold courage in a place no one envied. Joseph looked at Mary with a mixture of guilt and awe, guilt for not offering more, awe for her resilience. She met his gaze without accusation, because eternal love doesn't keep score during suffering. Instead, it leans closer, breath to breath, whispering strength into fragile moments. And somewhere between rejection and labor pains, heaven prepared to move. It's easy to celebrate miracles after they shine. It's harder to honor the pain that surrounds their arrival. Mary felt the waves of birth begin, intense and unstoppable, and there was no turning back. Joseph knelt beside her, his hands no longer shaping wood but steadying life itself. The world outside slept unaware that redemption was about to breathe for the first time. In that stable, poverty and prophecy collided in the most unexpected way. Rejection had led them there, but rejection could not stop what was promised. Because sometimes the place the world dismisses becomes the birthplace of hope. The stable was still, except for the sound of Mary's breathing growing deeper, heavier, more urgent with every passing moment. There were no soft beds, No warm lanterns placed carefully by servants, only straw beneath her and the faint scent of animals lingering in the cold air. Outside, the night stretched wide and indifferent, unaware that history was about to shift inside a forgotten corner of the world. Joseph knelt beside her, not as a carpenter now, but as a man trying to steady life with trembling hands. His heart pounded louder than the wind, because this wasn't just birth, it was destiny unfolding in real time. Mary gripped his arm through waves of pain, her body exhausted, yet her spirit anchored in faith. And in that fragile darkness, suffering and miracle stood face to face. Labor isn't poetic in the moment. It's raw, it's breathless, it strips away pride and leaves only instinct and courage. Mary felt every contraction like fire and purpose intertwined, like obedience being tested through physical agony. She wasn't thinking about prophecy then. She was thinking about survival, about bringing life safely into a world that had already rejected it. Joseph whispered encouragement, though fear trembled behind his words, because unseen strength doesn't mean absence of fear, it means moving anyway. If you've ever held someone's hand through pain, knowing you can't take it away but refusing to leave, you understand Joseph in that stable. There was no applause, no recognition, just the quiet battle between exhaustion and hope. And then, in the most unexpected of places, a cry broke through the dark. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't a trumpet, it was the fragile cry of a newborn, small and powerful all at once. Mary's body relaxed into relief, tears mixing with sweat, because miracle doesn't erase pain, it often comes through it. Joseph stared in disbelief, not at royalty wrapped in gold, but at humble beginnings wrapped in cloth. This was the liberator the oppressed people had prayed for, not on a throne, but in straw. The prophecy had taken on flesh, fragile and dependent, needing warmth and protection. And for a moment, the rejection, the journey, the doubt, all of it felt worth enduring. Because hope was no longer an idea, it was breathing. The stable, once cold and forgotten, now felt sacred. Even the rough walls seemed to hold their breath, as if creation itself recognized what had just happened. Mary held the child close, her exhaustion replaced by awe, her hidden tears now flowing freely. Joseph watched her, understanding that this wasn't just a birth, it was a calling that would stretch beyond their lifetimes. They had no crowd cheering, but they had something deeper, divine purpose fulfilled in silence. The world outside still slept, unaware that redemption had begun in the most uncelebrated way. And sometimes that's how heaven works, quietly, without spectacle, but permanently. It's important to see the contrast: empire in power, poverty in practice, soldiers patrolling cities while a child destined to change them lies unnoticed in a stable. That's the irony of divine strategy. It doesn't compete with noise, it rewrites it from the inside out. Mary looked at the child not with fear anymore, but with acceptance, understanding that her yes had led to this moment. Joseph felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct deeper than pride, stronger than doubt. He wasn't just guarding a family now, he was guarding a promise. And if you've ever held something fragile that carried your entire future, you know that mix of tenderness and fierce loyalty. Eternal love had taken a new shape: parenthood. The night slowly softened, as if aware that darkness had just been pierced. Mary hummed quietly, instinctively, not a royal lullaby but something simple, something born of faith and fatigue. Joseph adjusted the straw, trying to create comfort where there was almost none, because love often improvises when resources are scarce. There were no riches, no luxury, but there was peace, deep, grounded peace that doesn't depend on circumstance. The world had rejected them, yet heaven had trusted them. And that trust transformed their poverty into purpose. Humble beginnings had just become eternal legacy. But miracles don't remove future suffering, they introduce responsibility. Mary knew, even in her joy, that raising this child would not be easy in a land filled with tension and spiritual battle. Joseph understood that protection would require courage far beyond this night. The miracle was here, yes, but so was the journey ahead. Redemption had entered quietly, but opposition would not stay quiet forever. And as the first light of dawn hinted at the horizon, the story was only beginning. Because the strength required to bring life into the world is only the beginning of the strength required to raise it. People remember the miracle, but they rarely talk about the woman who had to wake up the next morning and keep living. After the birth, after the fragile cry in the dark, Mary didn't step into comfort, she stepped into responsibility. The stable didn't magically turn into a palace, the poverty didn't disappear, and the political oppression didn't soften overnight. She still had to nurse, to clean, to endure whispers from those who didn't understand her story. Because being chosen for divine purpose doesn't exempt you from ordinary struggle, it multiplies it. And that's something many women today understand deeply, carrying destiny in one arm while carrying exhaustion in the other. Mary stayed, not because it was easy, but because unwavering loyalty doesn't retreat when life gets inconvenient. She had already faced doubt from the man she loved, rejection from strangers, and the raw pain of childbirth without comfort. Yet what makes her strength extraordinary wasn't dramatic speeches, it was consistency. She kept showing up. She held the child through sleepless nights, through uncertainty, through questions she herself didn't have answers to. Unseen strength is like that. It doesn't ask for applause, it just endures. If you've ever held a family together while feeling like you were barely holding yourself together, you understand her courage. Faith isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet endurance that refuses to break. Joseph worked tirelessly, yes, but Mary carried something invisible that few recognized. She carried the emotional weight of being misunderstood. Some in Nazareth still whispered, still questioned, still tried to fit her story into categories that made them comfortable. Rejection doesn't always end after the first closed door. Sometimes it lingers in glances and half-spoken comments. Yet Mary didn't fight every rumor. She didn't defend herself with anger. She understood something profound. Divine purpose doesn't require human validation to remain true. And that kind of maturity takes spiritual depth. There's a reason her story echoes through centuries. It's not just about prophecy, it's about resilience. She stayed when doubt entered her home. She stayed when travel exhausted her body. She stayed when the world made no space for her child. And staying is harder than leaving most of the time. In a world where walking away is often easier than working through pain, her commitment feels revolutionary. Think about modern families for a moment. Divorce exists, misunderstandings exist, pride exists, and none of those are new. Even in Nazareth, relationships were tested by pressure and expectation. Mary and Joseph weren't insulated from human struggle, they were immersed in it. What made the difference was their shared obedience, their decision to protect the sacred promise rather than protect their pride. That lesson still stands. When love chooses humility over ego, something eternal forms. And that eternal love becomes legacy. Mary also faced the quiet fear every parent knows, the fear of not being enough. How do you raise a child destined for greatness without feeling small? How do you guide something holy while living in humble beginnings? She didn't have manuals. She didn't have mentors with experience in raising prophecy. She relied on faith the same way parents today rely on hope when the future feels overwhelming. Courage, for her, wasn't grand gestures, it was daily obedience in small tasks. And sometimes the most powerful leadership is the one practiced inside the home. As the child grew, so did the awareness that their journey would not remain hidden forever. Mary sensed that destiny would eventually draw attention, both admiration and opposition. The spiritual battle wasn't over, it had only shifted forms. Yet she didn't allow fear to shape her motherhood. She chose love over anxiety, trust over control. And that decision, repeated daily, became her quiet masterpiece. Because the woman who said yes once, kept saying yes every single day after. But here's the truth most people overlook. Strength doesn't mean absence of tears. Mary had moments of hidden tears, moments of questioning, moments where the weight felt too heavy. Still, she never abandoned the sacred promise entrusted to her. She proved that faith is not a one-time decision, it's a lifestyle of perseverance. And perhaps that's why her story still speaks across generations, across cultures, across broken homes and healing ones. Because at its core, it's not just about a miracle, it's about loyalty that outlasts fear. And that loyalty would soon echo beyond Nazareth, into every family willing to listen. When we retell this story, it's easy to romanticize it, to smooth out the rough edges and pretend it was all light and certainty, but the truth is far more human than that. Nazareth had broken expectations, political tension, fragile marriages, and yes, even separation existed in that world. Mary and Joseph weren't floating above reality, they were walking straight through it. They faced doubt, social pressure, rejection, exhaustion, and misunderstanding. And still, they chose faith over fear, loyalty over pride, obedience over convenience. That choice didn't make their lives easier, but it made them stronger. And strength built on sacred promise always leaves a legacy. Today, families still struggle with the same battles. Doubt creeps in, communication breaks down, ego speaks louder than humility. We live in a time where walking away is often faster than working through pain. Rejection can happen inside a home just as easily as outside it. But Mary's story reminds us that destiny often grows inside imperfect conditions. You don't need a palace to build purpose. You need courage to stay when it's hard. You don't need applause to keep your promise. You need unwavering loyalty to something greater than yourself. And sometimes the greatest miracle isn't supernatural. It's reconciliation. Think about this for a moment. Joseph had every reason to leave, yet he stayed. Mary had every reason to collapse under pressure, yet she endured. That combination, courage and obedience, became the foundation for redemption. In modern terms, that's like choosing to communicate when silence feels safer, choosing to forgive when pride wants revenge. It's deciding that love isn't just emotion, it's commitment tested under fire. And that's a lesson our generation desperately needs to remember. The world today still feels oppressed in different ways: financial pressure, social comparison, emotional exhaustion. We scroll through perfect images while fighting imperfect realities at home. But humble beginnings are not a curse, they are fertile ground for growth. Mary's journey proves that rejection does not cancel divine purpose. Closed doors don't mean destiny is denied, they sometimes redirect it. And the stable moments of your life, the ones you're embarrassed about, might be shaping something eternal. Because purpose rarely starts in comfort. Families break when fear leads and pride governs. But they heal when humility speaks first. Mary and Joseph protected their sacred promise by protecting each other's hearts. They didn't fully understand the future, yet they trusted the calling placed before them. That's faith, not blind optimism, but courageous consistency. And if two young souls in a forgotten village could model that kind of resilience, maybe we can too. Legacy begins with small, faithful decisions repeated daily. Let me speak directly to you for a second. If you're walking through doubt, if you feel misunderstood, if rejection has knocked at your door, you're not disqualified from purpose. Sometimes your dark night is preparing you for a dawn you can't yet see. Sometimes the stable you resent is the birthplace of your breakthrough. And sometimes the miracle you're waiting for is already growing quietly in your obedience. Hope isn't naive, it's necessary. And faith, when practiced consistently, reshapes generations. Mary's story doesn't end in Nazareth. It echoes into every home where love is tested. It challenges us to ask difficult questions. Are we protecting our pride, or our promises? Are we allowing doubt to lead, or courage to guide us? Are we closing doors out of inconvenience, while hope waits outside? Because destiny doesn't shout, it whispers, and only faithful hearts hear it clearly. And maybe, just maybe, the next chapter of redemption begins in families willing to stay. Now I want to ask you something honestly. What part of this story felt personal to you? Was it the doubt Joseph faced in the dark night? Was it Mary's courage when rejection closed every door? Or was it the reminder that humble beginnings don't cancel divine purpose? Because here's the truth, this isn't just their story. It's ours. How many times have we almost walked away when staying required courage? How many times have we closed doors out of comfort, while destiny waited outside? And how many miracles have we missed, because they didn't look impressive enough? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where doubt almost destroyed something sacred in your life? And what helped you stay? And I want to hear from you. Which song should we transform into a powerful story next? Drop the title below. It could be the next unforgettable journey we build together. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we uncover the destiny hidden inside them.